everyone? Can you hear me? Great, okay. Good morning. My name is Jean Stillman. I'm president of the Southern New York State Division of the United Nations Association of the USA. We are co-hosting this event with the Eleanor Roosevelt Leadership Center at Val-Kill. And I would like to introduce Kathleen Durham, who will be part of the program later. And she's also facilitating a group on governance. Let me step aside for a moment and let Jeff Urban speak about welcoming us to this lovely facility.
Good morning, everybody. On behalf of myself and our director, Lynn Bassanese, I want to welcome you all to the Roosevelt site. We are delighted to have you here today. We just completed 6 months ago a 3-year, $35 million renovation. And if you haven't seen that yet, you are missing one of the most significant and spectacular things, I think, in the Hudson Valley. You know, sometimes you plan a project and you hope it works out well. This worked out better than anybody could possibly have expected. And we'd like to invite you this afternoon, when you find yourself with some free time, to go over and take a look at the exhibits. I'm going to leave these out on the table. This will get you into the Roosevelt Presidential Library Museum for free. So just display this when you go in. And it's a wonderful opportunity to to introduce a new generation to the Roosevelts. I also want to say that we're very proud that last Wednesday, we launched Franklin, which is a website that now houses 350,000 pages of our documents online. Previous to that, we only had 16,000 pages, so we now have 350,000 pages that are available, both President Roosevelt's papers and Mrs. Roosevelt's papers, to anybody in the world. From the earliest days of World War II, FDR envisioned creating an organization that would promote global cooperation and peace. And on January 1st, 1942, he invited 25 nations to meet at the White House to sign a declaration to pledge to defend life, liberty, independence, religious freedom, and to preserve human rights and justice. FDR called this wartime coalition the United Nations. On November 30th, 1943, while at the Tehran Conference of the Big Three, FDR sketched out an outline of what he thought the United Nations organization might be set up to look like. And I passed out a copy of that on your table. And you'll notice it's got 40 UN, so 40 United Nations countries. There was going to be an executive committee, the 4 policemen, which is going to be made up of the United States, the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, and China. And then underneath the 40 nations, there's 4 very important committees that FDR wanted to see set up. ILO, the International Labor Organization, a health organization, agriculture, and food. So that speaks to what FDR saw as the priorities of this United Nations that he was seeking to create. Sadly, he died just days before he was to address the opening session of the conference that created the United Nations. And President Truman wisely decided to go ahead with that conference, and he appointed Mrs. Roosevelt to be a delegate from the United States to the United Nations. And Mrs. Roosevelt shared FDR's belief in the need for a world organization dedicated to peace. She worked tirelessly to ensure the success of the organization, and most notably and almost single-handedly drafted and assured the passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Your theme for today's meeting is the world we want. And that is, I think, the perfect theme for a meeting like this, at a place like this, on an anniversary like this. The Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum contains 17.5 million pages of documents. That would be a stack 16 times as tall as the Washington Monument if you stack them all on top of each other. And it always amazes me that you can't go more than a few dozen documents without coming across the words or phrases like future generations, our children's children, young people of the future, or tomorrow, meant in the long-term perspective. The Roosevelts were always thinking of the world that we want, but they were not just thinking of the world that they wanted in their time, but the world beyond their time, the world in our time. We are the future generations. We are the children of the children. We are the young people of the future, and their tomorrow is our today. And so we're charged with the task of continuing to work, to do the work of President and Mrs. Roosevelt, to create the world that we want, not just for ourselves here today, but for all the tomorrows to come. And to do that, you certainly have chosen the right place to begin that work. So we are delighted to have you here, and we want to welcome you here. And again, don't forget to pick up one of these little pins and go over and see the museum this afternoon. Thank you. These are only good for today, I'm sorry, okay? That we changed the color and you get shot.
I want to thank you all for accepting our invitation to come today, to join in this global conversation that Jeff just talked about on the conceptualization of the post-2015 Global Development Agenda. What happens after the Millennium Development Goals? You represent many different types of organizations: non-governmental, faith, schools, academia, human rights, councils, local government, business, UN association members, and we should have a really rich and rewarding conversation today. This is one in a series of events like this across the country. Our division held one on November 1st at the New York Times Conference Center. This responds to a growing call for active participation by the public, by you, in the world we want, and the world we want 2015. These consultations provide evidence and perspectives to our representatives and to our country about the challenges people face in improving their lives and those of their families and communities. By initiating these consultations now, before 2015, we hope to influence what comes after. You're part of a process with a special difference that today we are going to focus especially on human rights in this framework. So we'll look at the world we want and the various topics, but we'll also really consider human rights aspects and voice those for those who can't voice them. Each roundtable has a note taker and a facilitator, and there are flip charts if you would like to use those. You'll have a chance to talk about your subject and to bring out human rights perspectives. We have the good fortune that Fred Cartier is filming our event, and that will also help us with reporting later. He does this in the Hudson Valley. After our roundtable discussions, we'll reconvene in a plenary session, and you'll have a chance to tell everybody what your table discussed. One important request: you have a yellow ballot in your folder. Could you please look for that? And there's also a page that's maybe page 2 in your folder that talks about the various themes that are being talked about in the world we want. Please take a minute during the time you have with us to fill out the yellow ballot and be honest about your age. We're trying to get generational ideas. We're trying to get ideas about different parts of the country and how they think, and that helps. Thank you. We're happy that Marist College and New Paltz are already working with UNA in starting to establish a Mid-Hudson Valley chapter, and along with the Eleanor Roosevelt Leadership Center. You have some brochures about UNA USA. I hope you'll join. Initial membership is only $25. Students under 22 years old can enjoy a free membership as a campus advocate. You can come see me after the event if you'd like to talk about that. I'll save my thanks to everybody until the closing plenary, and I would now like to introduce Ryan Kaminsky. Ryan, why don't you come up? Ryan is the second Leo Nevis Human Rights Fellow at UNA USA and the UN Foundation. For the past year, he has crisscrossed the country, speaking with organizations and writing about human rights. He focuses on human rights, U.S. foreign policy, and international institutions. In previous work with the Council on Foreign Relations, International Institutions and Global Governance Program, he researched global and regional human rights and helped create an internet platform for these. Ryan holds a Bachelor of Arts in International and Global Studies from the University of Chicago and a master's degree in International Relations and Affairs from the Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. As a Fulbright scholar, he taught at the Hong Kong Institute of Education. He has also worked with Amnesty International and the Brookings Institution. Ryan, welcome. We look forward to your talk. Thank you.
Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Maybe be sure and grab one of these now so I don't forget later on. Good morning. I wanted to say thank you everyone for attending. It's really great to see this kind of turnout on a snowy day, and I think we're going to have a really fantastic conversation. I also wanted to say thank you very much to Ginger and the entire Southern New York State Division for putting so much hard work into organizing this event, as well as the FDR Presidential Library and Museum. This is truly a wonderful space. You know, coming from Chicago and living in Hyde Park in Chicago for a few years, I can see a few similarities. One is that it's in both places there's snow. But I think here it's a little bit more manageable, so that's great news. An observation of a precedent started, I think, last year by Gillian Sorensen, who is a really inspiring figure with UNA USA, UNA USA's advocate at large, who's now at Harvard University. I wanted to start with a brief reference to Eleanor Roosevelt, who, as we learned, chaired the former UN Human Rights Commission and played a major, if not pivotal, role in drafting and getting in securing passage of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as a reminder, is 30 articles written in language that most people can understand. It was drafted through nothing less than a Herculean effort involving policy experts, international relations experts, diplomats, philosophers, human rights experts, policy experts, who could forget lawyers, across a broad variety of belief systems, cultures, and even political systems across the world. And let's not forget this happened as the Cold War was just on the horizon, and you had incredible divisions between the East and the West. And I think it's also important to remember, once the declaration was drafted in the Human Rights Commission, it wasn't like it was done. It had to go to the Economic and Social Committee, then it had to go to the General Assembly Third Committee, and then it had to get finally approved by the UN General Assembly. A lot of work, but it got done. Nevertheless, as though the UDHR passed the General Assembly with 48 votes in favor and none against. So you can really say that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has really inspired countless voices across the world, binding international treaties, as well as an entire cast of human rights organizations and civil society groups that are really there to ensure that human rights is not just some colorful rhetoric or abstract principle, but solid reality on the ground. And just as Eleanor Roosevelt endeavored, and in my view succeeded, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as I mentioned, is written in a language that everyone can understand, not some complex legalese that only a few can access or understand or implement. It's really designed to be used for everyone. And I think this actually has a broad correlation to the post-2015 development agenda and the post-2015 process. Here we are, people from all different backgrounds coming together to really participate in this process, and as Ginger said, really influence the outcome. Much like Eleanor Roosevelt, when she was attempting to draft this declaration amongst all these different belief systems, cultures, and what have you, this is in a way what's happening with post-2015. You know, the Millennium Development Goals, for all the good they did and kind of creating a global vision, a global movement towards a broad set of goals, such as alleviating extreme poverty, empowering women and girls, as well as, of course, laying the pathway for a clean environment. There is a notable difference this time around. For all the good they did, the Millennium Development Goals were kind of written in a building not far from Grand Central Station, probably with a lot of coffee and very bad lighting by very few individuals. But as I said, this time is different. We have a whole international community involved in this process in developing the post-2015 goals. We have UN member states, the private sector, issue area experts, and who could forget, of course, civil society like we have here today. These groups, civil society, are meeting every single day at the United Nations in New York, across the United States, voila, as well as well beyond our borders to talk about this conversation and what really should be included in the post-2015 agenda. And we really can say without hyperbole that we're all engaging in a truly global conversation. Now, human rights in particular has emerged as kind of a cross-cutting theme in this regard. And in delegates, civil society groups, experts are thinking about how best human rights can be integrated across the process as a whole. Now, this has been, as you might expect, a very complex and very sensitive conversation. Some in civil society have even said, well, instead of the post-2015 goals, we should call them the human rights goals. Others have said, no, maybe we should call them instead the Sustainable Development Goals. This conversation continues. The release of a high-level report on the post-2015 process showed there is hope on the horizon, though, in making sure that human rights are included. The high-level report included specific references to human rights. It didn't have to. And it also called for eliminating extreme poverty by 2030. And of course, when we talk about human rights issues, we're talking about a whole cornucopia of topics that are not always the easiest to draw consensus about. This includes the somewhat eternal debate between civil and political rights and economic, social, and cultural rights on one hand, as well as the issue of accountability on the other. Now, one of the topic areas that has emerged frequently in the discussion of the post-2015 process is protecting the human rights of the disabled. The disabled make up an estimated 1 billion persons around the planet, with an estimated 50 million disabled persons in the United States alone. And again, just as the post-2015 process is discussing the human rights of the disabled, we're also having an important conversation on this topic in our country. And of course, I'm referring to the debate right now about the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. This is a real UN Human Rights Convention that the Senate is considering right now. The Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, or the CRPD for short, is a treaty that's been ratified by more than 130 countries around the world. And the good news is that it was kind of basically more or less Xeroxed from the Americans with Disabilities Act, which passed on a bipartisan basis in 1990 from the George H.W. Bush administration. What the ADA has done is basically become a global model for how countries can ensure the human rights and protections of their citizens back home. Now, despite the apparent, this seems like a really good idea. Let's ratify this treaty. Let's continue to be global leaders in human rights. But some are a bit concerned. Some worry about the cost of ratification and how this could impact U.S. sovereignty. Well, let me just say this. As Ambassador Samantha Power, the U.S. ambassador to the UN, has stated, this treaty will not cost the U.S. anything and will not require us to change any laws. In fact, again, we're ahead of the curve because we passed the implementing legislation in 1990 through the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, it's important to remember, ratifying the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities is not about changing the United States. Instead, it's about telling other countries, be more like us. This is exactly what Secretary of State John Kerry has said to the Senate, as well as in his engagement with civil society on this topic. Now, the convention has received support from hundreds of civil society organizations from across the U.S., including veterans groups, disability organizations, human rights groups, UN advocates, human rights groups, as well as some private sector support from organizations and entities like Coca-Cola, IBM, and even the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It also enjoys bipartisan support, including backing from Senator John McCain, Illinois' Dick Durbin, as well as who can forget Senator Bob Dole. And frankly, when you hear about bipartisan things in the Senate, which you don't hear about too often these days, unfortunately, this is really good news. So let's really watch this space and hope we can get this passed. Along these lines, I encourage everyone here to contact your senator. I'm from New York myself, and say that you support the CRPD and you want the Senate to ratify this. And this is important, as a vote can happen literally at any time. Now, I know some of you might be thinking, well, my senator probably supports this, so, check, I'm okay, everything's great. But there's more you can do. You can contact your representatives and say, be a bridge builder. Talk to your colleagues. Tell them why this is a priority for you. Tell them why it's important for the U.S. to exercise global human rights leadership through the United Nations, and that this is a priority. You can also submit op-eds to your local newspapers, and even, yes, talk about the CRPD on social media. In short, we need to keep a nationwide momentum going to get this treaty ratified, and hope the Senate will vote for ratification. Last year, around the same time we're having this conversation today, we came just 5 votes short of getting this treaty through. So I think when we look at this and look at all the momentum now, literally the tweet, the Facebook post, the op-ed, or the call to your representative's office really can make a difference. But one final point on this, this isn't just about telling other countries to be more like us. It's also about helping millions of Americans. It's about helping disabled veterans when they go to live or work abroad. It's about helping students who go to study abroad and making sure they're able to go and participate in their programs, and that countries protect the rights of the disabled, and making sure that the tenets of the Americans with Disability Act go well beyond our borders. Again, it's very important we keep our eyes on the ball on this, as again, a Senate vote can happen at any time. I also wanted to offer a note of thanks to all of you. Recent polling by the Better World campaign has found that 88% of Americans favor active U.S. engagement with the UN. 88%. That's quite a great number, but to be honest, unfortunately, it doesn't happen on its own. It happens when we have impassioned, organized, and hardworking advocates like all of you here today, a part of the largest UN network in the United States, if not the world. Not only caring about the principles of the UN and a strong US-UN relationship, but also extending these ideas in your communities and beyond. And while 2013 has witnessed many human rights challenges across the world, I believe this actually reminds us of the central role the UN and the US can play in advancing human rights protections. In Syria, following the passage of a recent UN Security Council resolution, we've seen one country's entire capacity to produce chemical weapons fall by the wayside, and it's disposing its chemical weapons on schedule. The Human Rights Council has also established a commission of inquiry on Syria, which is gathering evidence on human rights violations and developing a list of names of people who are likely guilty of war crimes. This list was recently transferred to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who in turn hinted that some of Syria's highest leadership is on this list. Hint, hint. We've also seen the Human Rights Council act on North Korea, recently establishing on an overwhelming basis an investigatory panel to track human rights violations in that country. Having been to Geneva and been in the room when the Council established this mechanism, it really was a defining moment and will help ensure a framework for accountability is created as we move forward. In the background, we have institutions like UNICEF, the World Food Program, and World Health Organization, and Refugee Agency, working hard in Syria to make sure that displaced populations have access to education, food, and medical care. The World Food Program alone has provided food for more than 3.4 million Syrians in Syria. Can you just imagine that if these UN agencies weren't acting on the ground, if they weren't working hard, what kind of a catastrophe we'd have on our hands? A meeting to diplomatically resolve the crisis in Syria is also scheduled to happen in late January. Most, if not all, key players in the Syrian conflict have said the way to resolve this crisis is through a political means, not military means. And of course, we have a very, very long way to go and it won't be easy, but it's good to know we're starting to get on the right track. In September, recently in September 2013, the very first high-level ministerial meeting occurred at the UN, focused exclusively on LGBT rights, and was attended by none other than Secretary of State John Kerry. This was a meeting that focused on really some very incredible and very monstrous threats to the rights of LGBT persons around the world just to live their lives the way they want. In the background, the Office of the High Commissioner has launched a major public relations campaign about LGBT rights, and it's celebrating its 20th anniversary this year. Also, just last week, the General Assembly Third Committee, one of the committees that focuses on human rights, which also had to approve the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, passed a groundbreaking resolution on the need to protect women human rights defenders. It wasn't easy to pass, but it did by consensus. And this will lay the groundwork for further protections in this area and much needed focus by the international community. In conclusion, I'll echo Eleanor Roosevelt once more. When the General Assembly Third Committee was trying to adopt one of the early drafts in the Universal Declaration, again, this was happening amongst different political views, belief systems, different interests from member states, different philosophies, all kinds of different input regarding human rights. She said, "It was a bit fatiguing, but worth it." And as I said, although not exactly the same, I think what we're doing here today with post-2015, coming from a broad cross-section of society, looking at a wide assortment of issues, really mirrors exactly what happened with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Also, if you'll permit me, I just want to quote one other human rights figure we've probably heard a lot about in the last couple of weeks. Nelson Mandela. He said, "A good head and good heart are always a formidable combination." Happy Human Rights Day, happy holidays, and thank you so much for coming.
There's coffee out there. If you haven't paid for your lunch yet, would you please go do that with the receptionist who's there? Thank you very much.
Did they eat lunch?
Oh, you get lunch now, yes. Go ahead and get your lunch, bring it to your table, and then when the group is comfortable, go ahead and start.
They're not under the United Nations, unfortunately. And I guess one other question, since we don't have much time, I want us to think about that.
Before we get started, if you would like to pick up a sandwich or two and take them with you, there's some food out there, and please feel free to do that here for a moment, because there were a couple of questions for him, and I'd like to give him that chance.
since the United States Congress has rejected the agreement that was hammered out with Iran, what is the next step? Does the UN have any plan for what happens when that, I mean, it seems...
Thank you very much. I will be totally honest in saying that this particular area isn't my area entirely of expertise, but to my knowledge, although it's kind of on the lifeline still in Congress, I don't know if they've actually gone through all the way with the legislation that would actually imperil the deal. So, I mean, I think there is still a chance that it could be okay, although you're right that it's not exactly going well in Congress right now in that area. On the other hand, I still think that the UN offers a convening space to further discuss this issue, and it's better to have that than not to have it. But I do think, again, that the deal, whether it's good or bad, whether you agree or disagree with it, still stands the way it was originally negotiated, although there is legislation you discussed in Congress right now.
Others? Okay. Thank you very much. Oops, do we have one there? One over there.
Since we are here to pay tribute to Eleanor Roosevelt, who first advocate of the Human Rights Commission in the United Nations, what action United Nations taking right now for the discriminatory action by the North Korea? They arrested 2 American citizens a year ago. Then they released one new man yesterday. Another 10 is still there. I'm sure there must be a good, profound reason they do discriminatory action. I want you to hear what the United Nations is preparing for that in terms of human rights.
Sure. This is a really good question, and I think that this is one area where the kind of, symphony of UN human rights mechanisms kind of shines. For one, the Human Rights Council Commission of Inquiry is operating on North Korea, gathering testimony, documenting cases of abuses, trying to really build a case for war crimes, crimes against humanity. And this is big. This is one of the first times a commission has been established when there's not actually an armed conflict happening. That's just one example. Another is the General Assembly recently passed a resolution by consensus condemning, deploring, naming, shaming human rights abuses in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. Of course, the other hand is there's no real binding enforcement power to this, but it is keeping this issue at the center stage. It is the UN shining a light on this issue. Finally, one of the mechanisms we were discussing at our table is the Human Rights Council Universal Periodic Review Mechanism. And this is a UN human rights mechanism where the human rights records of all UN members are reviewed. And thus far, it's had a 100% participation rate. So even the DPRK, when it's its turn, every state gets reviewed, I believe, every 4 years, goes to its review. Every state has gone to its review, and so has the DPRK. And this offers a forum not only for other UN members to say, you really need to work on freedom of expression. You really need to free prisoners. You really need to, take a second look at your human rights record. It also allows civil society groups, people who have faced human rights violations in the North, to offer their testimony and to directly challenge the delegation at the Human Rights Council in Geneva. So there's still a long way to go, but it's definitely active, and it's a lot of these systems, a lot of these different instruments and tools working together.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you very much again for your talk. This is my time for thank yous before I turn the microphone over to Kathleen Durham. Thanks to the FDR Presidential Library and Museum for this wonderful facility, for hosting us, and for making tours available for everyone who's interested. I want to thank Kathleen Durham, Executive Director, and Maureen Benedict, her Executive Assistant, of the Eleanor Roosevelt Leadership Center at Val-Kill for their close and excellent collaboration. And I also want to thank, in the back there, our division intern, Keith Uffer, from SUNY New Paltz Global Education Program. I want to give him a hand. And finally, thank you to our facilitators, who include faculty from nearby colleges and schools, or they are members of the Board of Southern New York State Division, and particularly for those who switched very quickly this morning when we had a couple of vacancies. Thanks also to students from State University of New York at New Paltz and Marist College, who have joined us today. Some of them are taking notes or they're not writing on flip charts. I guess we didn't use flip charts. And finally, we're going to add your names to our newsletter mailing list, which gives updates on our activities. On February 7th, you're invited to join us at the United Nations at the 6th Annual Mid-Atlantic Regional Conference and Members Day. It's titled, United Nations, Building Peace in an Age of Upheaval. It will include panels on peace, on the post-2015 development agenda, and on human rights. I hope many of you will be able to come and spread the word amongst your agencies, and we'll make sure you get information. So, to wrap up, thank you for all of the hard work you've done in these roundtables. We look forward to seeing the notes. Keith will go around and collect them from each laptop on our flash drives so that we can go ahead and have a report. And then, of course, we will have the video report on television. Thank you very much. Kathleen?
Hey, you can hear me from right here. No. It doesn't work. So before we get started on the wrap-up, I really want you to give Ginger a big hand. I want to tell you something about Ginger. I call her the she's like this one-woman trunk show. She does it all. She's been a delight to work with, and no matter what time of night you call her, she's on it. So thank you, Ginger, for putting all the work that you do. And in addition to that, she's taken her husband's nonprofit to a whole new level. Right? Yes. Okay, so we're at the fun part of this, where we get to hear from you now on wrapping up this day and get out of here before the snow has us spending the night. So the first round table, who's going to report from a good education? If you would come up here, you got a microphone right there. We have two tables. First table, whoever has the mic, stand up, and if you could be really concise and on point, we'd all be very happy people.
Okay. We discussed the goals for 2015. I'm sorry. Surely.
Thank you.
There any more requests that I? My name is Al Ragucci. I'm currently retired educator. I'm teaching as an adjunct at Empire State College in the business department. And I think some of the points that we made at this table will be similar points that are made elsewhere. A number of you I overheard, and we discussed here, said that basic needs have to be dealt with first in many of the developing countries, that education isn't going to be possible if people are hungry, if they don't have clean water, they don't have housing available. So we said that was an important goal for 2015, that the United Nations should concentrate on providing basic needs, particularly in developing countries. Gender equality as well should be a major goal. It's received a lot of publicity lately, particularly with the struggles going on in the Middle East. In the second class, women are treated as in many of those countries, and also the issue of gender equality in the United States. Although we did point out, or at least I pointed out, that's one area of education in the United States which is actually doing pretty well. Most of the undergraduates, or a majority of undergraduates in the United States today are women. A majority of the law school students today in the United States are women, and a majority of the medical students in the United States are women. So, although the United States is behind in many areas in education, certainly compared to Western Europe, that's one area where we think the United States can serve as somewhat of an example. We also recommended universal pre-K for the results of studies concerning the impact of universal pre-K in the United States and around the world is pretty strong to indicate that that is the way of improving education worldwide. One of our members mentioned that universal pre-K should also begin to start including what's called a civic literacy. That is dealing with some of the basic issues of life. Some of the problems we face here with struggling lower income students especially, single parenthood, civic duties. Some of those issues should be included in a universal pre-K. And one of the issues we also mentioned here in the United States is the funding of schools here, the inequality of funding. You only have to look to Westchester County and the Bronx to know what the impact of inequality of funding can mean to the type of education, the type of schools that we have. So those are some of the main issues we discuss here.
Thank you. Great job. And the second education table, please state your name.
Where are you?
Yeah, it's going to be on all over the internet.
Hi, my name is Stephen Miller. I teach philosophy at Oakwood Friends School and Marist College. We spent most of the time talking about the first question about what constitutes a good education, and the emphasis of our discussion was how one can move the definition of a good education away from just a notion of literacy towards more complex ideas such as, and I'll give you a list of some of the main topics that we were talking about, cosmopolitanism and global citizenship. There was a lot of discussion about the importance of arts education and appreciation and its role in the education towards the whole person. The notion of broadening the curriculum and education towards sustainability and social ingenuity, and in its role in broadening general perspectives of the students. We also concurred with the idea of a universal pre-K and the importance of emphasizing gender disparity. And let's see, one of the questions towards the end, well, one of the questions was about what the human rights dimension, and we started with the emphasis that clearly this is a fundamental human rights issue, and that progress in the education field was clearly tied with progress in all of the other tables here, that notions of, I think, was it water and sustainability and good governance and all of those kind of issues are clearly tied in with education, and that the point, the environment, we talked a lot about environment, the point of education should be forwarding all of those as well. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you so much. So Article 26 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights starts off with everyone has a right to education. One of the things that I want to add to that, because with rights come responsibilities, and in the Declaration it also says that if we have a right to be educated, then we have the obligation to learn as much as our capabilities allow us, and where possible, share our knowledge and experience with others. So I think those two things are very important, the right to education and then the right to be responsible for that education for yourself and how you impact others with that. The next round table is access to clean water and sanitation, including protecting freshwater resources and oceans. Did we have a round table? Great. So would you state your name?
Hi, I'm Jen Mayfield. I'm with AAUW. One of the excuse me. One of the main issues that we talked about was that while some of the Millennium Development targets have been reached or nearly been reached for in terms of drinking water, sanitation lags behind, which is an issue because then it causes cross-contamination and the the new clean drinking water is then contaminated by the old sanitation problem. So we think one of the main focuses needs to be catching up the development of sanitation infrastructure with the development of water supply infrastructure. We obviously think that access to clean water and sanitation is a core human right. As education mentioned, you can't really get an education if you don't have enough to drink. You can't grow a farm if you don't have enough water to water your crops. Let's see. We also talked about any solutions that we do have to touch on the 4 elements of sustainability, which are environmental, social and cultural, economic, and governance. Donor countries need to be more willing to do tech transfers and joint implementations in host countries. And there needs to be a greater campaign for education, both in terms of what clean drinking water is and also clean drinking water as a human right. I think that about covers it.
So I think that would go to the article of everyone has a right to a standard of living that's adequate, which would include environmental protections. And along with that right, there's got to be a responsibility. So if we have a right to benefit from the Earth's bounty, then we have the obligation to respect, care for, and restore the Earth and its natural resources. Equality between men and women, including protection against crime and violence. Did you guys have the biggest group? No? Okay, so state your name and turn to the camera. Face the camera. Oh, it's Tiffany. Oh, no, I was happy. No. Okay, why don't we go to the next group while you have... So is there a group on action taken on climate change? Yes, climate change and energy. Okay, great.
Yes. Thank you for the wonderful segue into the climate and energy. My name is Nick Bear. I am an undergraduate student at Marist College. And our roundtable focused on both climate change, action on climate change, and on sustainable energy. So we started out our discussion talking about our basic knowledge. We had a lot of different perspectives here, so we were able to touch base with our own sets of knowledge that we had here and our concerns with the current system, both in terms of climate and energy. So one of the things that we felt was a concern was focusing on building sustainable communities in terms of building sustainable homes and promoting sustainable development in that way, as well as sustainable buildings and other projects. We discovered that we needed to come down harder on companies that are creating the problems, that are polluting, and we need more regulations in order to monitor their behaviors. We've recognized that global warming is a fact, and the question here really is the cause, and that's really where the center of the controversy is here. And we've also recognized that with the global climate change recently and the rising ocean tides because of the global polar ice caps melting, that everyone living on the coasts or on islands are at serious risk of having their homes be damaged. And we were also obviously very interested in finding ways to develop energy sustainably. So we then moved on to looking at what our priorities should be for the next 10 to 15 years. And one thing that we discovered we should do is strive to create a better building code in order to promote sustainable energy. So ways that we could do this are implementing things like green roofs or overpasses, any kind of roof where there is space to create some kind of garden or green roof. We can use this instead of using cement, because cement will absorb heat and that will in turn release more carbon dioxide into the environment, whereas if we were able to have green roofs, we would actually be contributing back oxygen as opposed to carbon dioxide. And in the long run, this would actually reduce energy bills because it would keep the temperature down. We wouldn't be putting so much monetary investment into our energy bills. We also discovered a new type of cement called green cement, where you could actually, the cement in the process uses less carbon in the process of making it. So we came to the conclusion as well that as countries develop, they don't necessarily have to develop as America and the European powers that are developed now developed in the past. Something that we decided is that developing countries now can learn from our mistakes, and since we have these new technologies that can promote sustainable development, these new developing countries, we can give them our input and implement the new technologies to develop sustainably as opposed to contributing more to the global climate crisis. And we do need to recognize that there are leverage points where we can make a large impact. For example, we're not going to say that all of a sudden everyone needs to switch over to green cars, because that's something that may not be economically or otherwise feasible. But if we can find certain small aspects of life that we can change and implement this widespread, we can start making changes. One way that we can do this is through marketing the problem of climate change and sustainable development. So then, as we looked at what partnerships we can create and how we can proceed and what our goals can be, we discovered that obviously work with the United Nations would be something that's important, but we can also look to domestic governments to implement these changes. And something that we also discovered we would have to tie to the climate change, action on climate change, would be the monetary aspect of it. We would have to convince corporations and convince people that it actually it does have value, and it would be more valuable in the long run to have sustainable development and to maintain a sustainable climate, as opposed to just focusing on the expense of it now. The costs would be much higher in the long run if we're not developing sustainably. One really great idea that we came up with here is in terms of education, and we just heard about how important education is for the global community, and something that we might be able to implement in terms of developing sustainably would be to have some kind of class and teach students at a very young age the ways in which they should be contributing to our global climate in sustainable ways. For example, we see today at a young age you get health courses, and you teach students how to eat correctly and how to live a healthy lifestyle and be physically fit and things like that. You teach them those smart, healthy ways of life. If we could implement healthy behaviors and healthy living in terms of climate and energy, that's something that would really move from the bottom up in the future. And then, of course, the aspect of human rights, which is why we're here today. We have determined at this table that it should be a right for all of us to live in a clean planet. So if someone is littering or someone is destroying the planet, it's violating our rights to a clean planet. And this is something that we're very passionate about. If we're able to also link this climate change and these disasters that we've been seeing over time, if we're able to link this back to the freedom from fear and the freedom from want for those who are living on the coast and whose homes are getting destroyed, those who are in areas where the food development is not so strong, where they're not having clean water or access to food, things like this are the reasons why this relates back to human rights directly. And then, of course, we looked at making this an equitable transition. And we have recognized that climate change is an equalizer, and it doesn't discriminate from rich and poor. And therefore, there have to be ways to promote sustainable living. And as I mentioned before, we can pursue this through education. We can also pursue this through government regulations, and have, as I said, our domestic governments enforce this more. And finally, we can look to the government and to, I guess, community colleges and things like that, where we can focus on marketing education for moving labor to sustainable research and sustainable energy workers. For example, we can teach those how to create sustainable plants and how to operate in sustainable energy plants and environments like that. So overall, we had a great talk. Thank you.
You did. You guys did a lot of work. So the reason I said, oh, it's Tiffany, is because Tiffany was the only name I knew from up here. So Tiffany, have at it.
Good afternoon, everyone. I don't think my name is Tiffany Carr, and I'm the Director of Public Affairs and Communications with Planned Parenthood Mid-Hudson Valley.
You got to go out there. Make that oh.
Go back
there.
Go back there. Face the camera.
Oh, here.
You want to stand here?
Is this good? Okay. So our table supposedly was dealing with equality between men and women, and our first job was immediately to change the sign so that we were dealing with equality between women and men. It's laughable, but we really discovered that it makes a huge difference. Language and terminology around this issue really can change and sharpen the focus that we need to have on equality. And so some of the things that we really looked at as problems that were not really addressed in some of the documents that we were reading is the idea of sexism and patriarchy. If we don't deal with sexism and patriarchy, we're going to have a really hard time dealing with equality, pay equity, and some of the other issues, gender violence, that we had originally come up with. We basically dealt with a Northern American experience because that was our experience at the table. So we really focused on this country, what we saw as some of the problems here. Very often the United States wants to be number one around the world, and it's really hard to do that when you have problems here that you have to walk the walk in order to be a model for other areas and other governments. I'm trying to read notes and do this all at the same time. So some of the problems we looked at were definitely women's autonomy. Until we control our own bodies, we're going to have a really hard time even getting pay equity, even having some of the other things that we addressed as issues. We're looking at the tearing down of Roe v. Wade across the country. Originally, this was a plan that many that wanted to get rid of that piece of legislation that was made legal by the Supreme Court in 1973. We're looking at a state-by-state tearing apart that particular law. We're looking at patriarchy. Women have no value, or our value is defined by men. We're looking at this language for the CDC, which talks about pregnancy and about if you're of reproductive age, what do you need to do to stay healthy? Again, looking at women as sort of an object of a bearer of children and not as a whole human being. Pregnancy discrimination in the workforce is also something that if you are pregnant and you need a stool to sit down, or you would like to go to the bathroom, or you would like a glass of water, an employer can discriminate against you and fire you for that. There's a Women's Equality Act here in the state of New York is something that was attempted to be passed last session, and even in a state like New York, did not succeed. It is still not law. Again, politicians, we know that definitely, making our Congress, our lawmakers look more reflective of the actual country that we live in would definitely be a way to provide role models and also change some of this discussion and make things more equitable. One of the things that we looked at for sustainability is that we actually have a lot of laws on the books that we don't enforce. Looking at laws around domestic violence and sexual assault, these laws that are actually out there are rarely enforced and also not known about. We also discussed Title IX. Title IX, as many people know, may have to deal with sports in schools, but it also says that if you're a teenager and you're pregnant, you are still entitled to education. And we have schools that will tell young women, you know, you're going to be bullied and you're going to be picked on, so why don't you leave school? That's illegal. And it's not very widely known, and obviously discriminates against women because the young boys who may have impregnated that young woman are not told that. Sorry, I'm trying to go down here the list. again, talked about language. We talked about privilege. We have to acknowledge the privilege of folks. Again, that sort of deals with the language and sexism and misogyny. We talked about the federal living wage policy. There's a lot of discussion on a minimum wage. We need to then change that language to talk about a livable wage, not a minimum wage. Federal support for families. Some of these questions, I think we all had this sort of duh moment. Yes, these are human rights. We had a sigh, duh. I think, did I kind of capture everything? It's sort of hard to read other people's. Oh, right. And obviously, sort of, maybe not obviously, is that we looked at the table and realized there was only one man. Because again, the assumption is, oh, women's rights, that's women's work, that's women's stuff. Only women are going to do that. Only women will talk about childcare. Only women will talk about gender violence. Only women will talk about sexual assault. And until we change that paradigm and have men know that these issues also affect them, that childcare affects their family, this will not change. The end.
And so absolutely, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights speaks very specifically that everyone is entitled to all the rights and freedoms regardless of sex and gender. I want to say that for us at the Eleanor Roosevelt Leadership Center, we feel very strongly that to change that conversation, to bring about that equality, to have people actually work together as individuals without regard to sex or gender, that we need to step out there and begin to change that conversation, bring men into the conversation. And that is very much missing around the world. There are countries that are beginning to understand that, particularly in South Africa, for example, that if you want the men to actually think of women differently, you've got to bring them into the conversation. It's like anything else. And so we're committed to doing that, hopefully with the boys' leadership. I know people out here who keep hearing me say that, saying, please don't say that again. But it's really important that we do that. I think a feminist embraces all. That's just a personal opinion. Okay, then we move to a very lively discussion on an honest and responsive government. The very name of it is kind of scary. Did I skip over? You were looking, okay, good. Okay, so.
Well, hi. Unlike Tiffany, I cannot stand.
Up, Maureen.
I cannot stand, hold the laptop, move the cursor. I can't do it. Is this okay, Fred?
Here?
Is this all right, Fred?
You can do it? Okay, great.
Okay, great, thanks. So as Kathleen said, an honest and responsive government, we were charged with having that conversation, and I have to start with a disclaimer that this is a group of very opinionated and experienced women, so I'll try to be concise. We actually started out with a reference to a commercial that you may have seen on television recently, where this woman is walking through an incredible garden, pondering a square pizza box and a round pizza pie. And the question is, what would you think about if you didn't have to think about money? And I think it's important to remember that there are a whole lot of people in this room today that are not in this room today because they're wondering where they're going to sleep tonight or how they're going to feed their family. So I think we should remember that. So when we talked about good governance, the first question that came up is, what are the obstacles to good governance here locally? Because we did also focus our conversation on national issues. The first thing that came up were issues around freedom of assembly and how very sad that is that something that we thought we had gotten through many, many years ago continues to be an issue even here locally in Dutchess County, as some examples were cited. We also talked about how incredibly important it is for our government to be transparent, and that lack of transparency is due largely in part to the volumes and volumes of legislation and levels of government that exist, and how could we possibly understand what it is that our government is telling us when it's just physically impossible to get through some of the language to get to the core. We know that there are accessibility issues. They're related both to physical accessibility as well as accessibility to power. We talked about corruption, and corruption in the form of both passive and aggressive. So I will not even bother to bid simply because the person who always is awarded a bid is in the mix. Or knowing that it's done already. So mass incarceration was something that we spent a lot of time talking about. The incredible percentage of African American males that are incarcerated, and then the consequences of that incarceration if it was a felony. In some states and some communities, loss of a right to vote, loss of public housing, and what that can do to a community and to a family. We also talked about campaign finance reform and how that really has to happen for a government to be inclusive and to be transparent and to be free of corruption. And we talked a little bit about our own personal responsibility in this and how a lack of an educated electorate has created some of the situations that have occurred. That being said, that does not mean that by not voting we've given up our rights. Just simply that we need to remind ourselves that if we are going to affect change, that we do have to vote. We know that in order for the government to work for us, one of the things we all have to do is search for common ground in whatever area that might be, and that it is the government's responsibility, and by that we mean all of us, to create an environment that allows people their basic human rights and then allow each person individually to make a decision as to how far they want to excel beyond that basic state. We also talked a little bit about, we must have been hearing you guys, what would a government look like if women, what would the world look like if women ran the show? And it was interesting. We did talk a lot about how women approach things a little bit differently, but we also talked a little bit about, well, if it's true that we are not able to get up into higher levels of government without corporate backing, how would women get there and be any different than some of the people that we see right now? And then something was brought to our attention that Dr. Martin Luther King said, and he said, be very careful not to create a generation of technocrats, because by doing that, you'll remove the heart of the people. And just a statement, and because I have absolutely no shame, if you believe that human rights and housing go hand in hand, see me after, and we can talk about Habitat for Humanity.
By the way, Maureen's daughter is here too, Shannon, who is sitting there at the women's table. So she's managed to create yet another social justice activist who's going to become a lawyer. So I think, did I miss a table? Did I get everybody? So we've come to the end of this lovely day. You've traveled in weather. You're going to go back out in weather. But I can't end without an Eleanor Roosevelt quote, and of course it has to do with human rights. And Carol at my table made a very, really, I thought, a wonderful observation when we were talking about our role in government and our responsibility to vote. And that what is happening is that more and more people are not voting at the local levels. And that's where the change must start. You can't just start it at the presidential level, because who's supporting that president makes all the difference. And so that of course, supports Eleanor Roosevelt's statement about human rights. Where, after all, do universal human rights begin? In small places, close to home, so close and so small that they cannot be seen on any map of the world. Yet they are the world of the individual person, the neighborhood he lives in. At the time, it was just a he, okay? So he, she. The school or college he attends, the factory, farm, or office where he works. Such are the places where every man, woman, and child seeks equal justice, equal opportunity, equal dignity without discrimination. And unless these rights have meaning there, they have little meaning anywhere. Without concerted citizen action to uphold them close to home, we shall look in vain for progress in the larger world. In celebration of Nelson Mandela's life, I think he did a really great job of that. And the two things I heard him say today, one was that if you want the world to change, you have got to take that time and change yourself. That's the first thing you need to do. And then the second is to forgive and involve yourself. So with that, thank you for celebrating the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I think it's the 65th year, 65th. And Eleanor says, I know that in many countries the world over, the anniversary of the acceptance of the UDHR was celebrated. I hope it will continue to be throughout the years, since only if we take it seriously enough and try to live by it, will it accomplish the object we all hope for and be one of the foundation stones of a peaceful world. I wish that for you. Thank you so much for coming.